Welcome to part 2 of C++ or C++ CLI. Now in part 1 I went through a little bit about C++ and the options and C++ native code and so forth. And in part 2 here I want to go just a little deeper and explain just a little more fully what the C++ CLI portion of this is. Now before we talk about that, let's talk about CLR managed C++ applications. Now in part 1 I mentioned that anytime you code in C# or VB.NET, then you are automatically coding in a CLR managed environment. But with C++ we kind of have a little different option. Now let's clarify some terms here. CLR stands for the Common Language Runtime, and CLI stands for the Common Language Infrastructure. Now the CLR is an implementation of the CLI. Now both of these are Microsoft brainchilds, and they were really designed for use with the Microsoft .NET framework. So what's the big CLR deal here? Why are we even mentioning this? Why do you see so much debate about this out there on the internet? Well, when we code to the Common Language Runtime, or the CLR, the code doesn't compile down to machine code that just runs directly on the computer. So we're talking about non-native C++. And I mentioned in part 1, non-native C++ means nothing's governing it. It's wide open. It can run as fast as it wants to, but it's also running without any guardrails. If it misuses memory, you'll have a memory leak. If it misuses types or inadvertently changes types, you can lose data or confuse data. All right? But what happens with the Common Language Runtime is the code doesn't go to machine code that runs directly on the computer. What it does instead is it compiles to an intermediate language, and then this intermediate language basically puts wrappers around the code, if you will, and it manages various tasks. We'll just call them housekeeping tasks here. All right? It makes sure that memory gets released like it should. It checks your types. It does all kinds of things for you. Now, CLI is the open specification. Again, this was developed by Microsoft, and a lot of people out there think the CLR is Microsoft's version and the CLI is some magic open source version. Not so. The CLI is the open specification that was developed by Microsoft, and it was standardized again by International Standards Organization, ISO, and ECMA. You may recognize ECMA there if you've ever heard of ECMAScript, which we all call JavaScript. ECMA designs, applies, and all that stuff, those standards for that language as well. Now, the CLR is the Microsoft development implementation of the CLI. And the way it's implemented in the Microsoft-shaped world is through the Microsoft .NET framework. So when you open Visual Studio and you begin coding in C# or VB.NET, you are coding in the Microsoft .NET framework world, and when you compile that, it's not going all the way down to machine code. It's going down to that intermediate language, and then it's going to be managed by these wrappers that Microsoft has built out there. Now what's going to happen, same thing in C++. If we're doing C++ in a CLR, or really they're calling it the CLI because the CLR comes from the CLI. Just a little trick there to confuse you even more. C++/CLI means that we're now writing C++ code that is subject to the CLR. Now that means C++ code that is not going to have memory leaks. It's going to check our types. It's going to watch our conversions and all kinds of things for us. Is this good? Yes. Is it bad? Yes. It totally depends on what you're trying to do. And in a separate video, I'm going to kind of come at this same type subject from a little bit different perspective, and we'll talk about C++ options. But that's the end of part 2 here. I just kind of want to help you get your head wrapped around this phrase, this acronym soup that you're going to see out there in documentation about whether you're writing native C++ or C++ CLI.